Hello, my name is David Malone. I'm rector of the UN University and an Undersecretary General of the UN system. I'm really sorry not to be with you in person in Dresden, but I know you're going to have a very useful virtual conference. Why do I say in person in Dresden? Because Dresden is such a fantastic city. Some of you will be sitting there right now, and you know what a glorious place it is, both historically, in terms of how it was reborn after the Second World War, in terms of its institutions, be it an extraordinary orchestra, opera, university. It's a relatively small city that has it all. So for those who haven't yet been to Dresden, I urge you to visit Flores in the future in person, perhaps attend one of the conferences in person. I'm not a scientist myself. I write in the social sciences at the intersection of political science, development studies, and also law. And when I'm not with UNU, I teach in law school, the NYU Law School in New York. But that doesn't mean, like most other people, that one isn't interested in science. Everybody is interested in science at some level. And although no expert in any scientific discipline, I wanted just to mention to you a few experiences when I was younger that bring home the subject matter of UNU Flores to me. Before that, I want to salute the director of UNU Flores, Edeltraud Günther. We were extremely lucky that she applied for the job. She's a noted scholar, works in interdisciplinary ways, and also has been a living public good in Germany because she so often has contributed to and chaired inter-university functions and functions that bring together researchers from all over the country, and indeed many researchers from abroad. She's been a fantastically dynamic force within the UNU system, and I'm sorry not to be with her at the moment in welcoming you. I also want to pay tribute to the chair of the advisory board of UNU Flores, who comes not very far from Germany, from the Netherlands. His name is Wim van Viersen, and he has been a research manager at the highest levels of quality on water cycle issues. And again, we're extraordinarily lucky having him leading the International Advisory Committee of Flores. Now, to my experiences as a young blade. When I was 8, my parents popped me in their baggage and took me to Iran, where we were very happy as a family, and we stayed 5 years. An extraordinary country then. It was in prehistoric times for most of you, the 1960s. And the country was changing a great deal. But it's a country of extraordinary rich history. And the history of water management in Iran is a very proud one and goes back millennia to the Keynote system, underground canalization of scarce fresh water that crisscrossed much of the country, bringing water to even very dehydrated, arid regions, which allowed Iran to prosper in its various political and border configurations over the millennia. Today, water is Iran's biggest challenge. Some people think the United States is Iran's biggest challenge. I don't. I think its biggest challenge is managing very scarce water for a population that has tripled in size from about 30 million to probably over 90 million, closer to 100 million perhaps today. And this makes water the most precious resource other than human ingenuity, which also does well in Iran in managing the future destiny of the country. The Qanats have started collapsing in on themselves from overuse, and this millennium-old system is beginning no longer to be available to most of the country. Dams were built, but some of them, like elsewhere, proved as problematic as they were useful, and overall, water is a significant challenge. Now, the first and founding director of UNU, Flores, I should mention, is a distinguished Iranian water scholar and manager who is currently Iran's water minister in the guise of being Iran's energy minister. Water is lumped in with energy in Iran. Both are very important to the country. And I'm happy to be able to recall the very distinguished tenure of Reza Ardakanyan as the founding director, who got this institute off the ground in very, very creative, constructive ways. The second resource I wanted to mention is soil. In a country as heavily populated as India, which I lived in much more recently, soil quality, soil enrichment, how crops are cycled through soil, how many crops in a given year can safely be cultivated. These are critical questions in a country of 1.3, soon 1.4 billion people. And it's a country much smaller than China. So although much of the country is migrating or has been migrating towards cities, about 2/3 of the population of India are still rural, and the COVID pandemic makes more of the city dwellers return to their rural roots. So everything to do with soil and agriculture in a country like India, which is on its way up globally, we all know that, soil is a critical challenge, issue, and resource. And I couldn't live there for long without bumping into it again and again and again as such a capital question in the country. And of course, it interacts productively and otherwise with water and waste. The third resource bringing together the nexus of Flores is, of course, waste. And when I was a young adult, I went to Egypt to study Arabic, which I loved trying to learn. I was never very good at it, but it's a fantastic language. And Cairo is one of the great cities of the world. So it was a privilege for me to be there. I ran into the significance of waste in Cairo because garbage was considered a resource, not a problem. It was picked up it has its own economic value, and whole communities known as Zabalayin live on the garbage mounds, picking them clean of anything that can be resold, unfortunately leaving the mounds themselves smoldering and putting the populations on the mounds at risk. If the mounds were used more productively, reused in agriculture, in industry, in other ways, Egypt would be a richer country for it. But it was wonderful to see a very underprivileged component of Egypt's society being able to gain often quite reasonable livelihoods from urban waste. Now, the Nexus doesn't think so much of urban waste, but urban waste can be a major resource in any developing country, and I would argue any developed country. In the life of UNU, we are a small institution, I should add. There are probably about 1,600 of us in all, perhaps 400, 500 researchers, small numbers of graduate students in 5 locations, 5 of our 13 locations around the world. For us, partnership is absolutely critical. We rarely have the critical mass necessary to bring about startling results on our own, although individual scholars and researchers can bring about startling results on their own, as we continually discover. For us, being able to work with larger partners, bringing an international, a developing country, often perspective to joint research work is something that has been very, very important to us nearly from the outset. Our first research group outside of Tokyo, where we were headquartered by our founding charter, was in Helsinki, and it focused on development economics. In our charter, the baseline goal for UNU is to prove itself of utility to developing countries. And that's always been our objective, not least in working with many institutions in the developing world and with many colleagues from the developing world. UNU has always directly and indirectly been inspired by the challenge increasingly met, although many countries remain in fragile situations, of global development. This, in turn, of course, causes the UN to wonder how, beyond its own programs, which are significant in some areas, indeed dominant in some areas, in humanitarian coordination, the UN is the dominant actor. In food aid, the UN is the dominating coordinator of action and channels a great deal of food aid. The work of UNICEF has been groundbreaking and never challenged, often complimented by others, but never challenged by others in championing the rights and also what we owe children and their mothers throughout the world, but particularly in the developing world. But rarely is the UN the dominant actor in a field. It is an important actor with a number of agencies. It has been, above all, a normative actor. setting standards, setting policy, or trying to distill policy options for member states. And for a long time, development was an ideological battlefield between different schools of thought. And at one end of that battlefield stood a number of institutions of the developing world and the UN, in which developing countries have a plurality of voices. And on the other, some international financial institutions which contributed a great deal from the outset, but have always had different intellectual and ideological orientations from the UN, or so it was until about 20 years ago. And about 20 years ago, this argument between the UN and some of the international development banks or other financial institutions had burned itself out, because nobody turned out to be absolutely right and nobody turned out to be absolutely wrong. And finally, after 50 years of disputation, it occurred on these institutions that rather than just pretending to cooperate, they might actually try active cooperation. And that is in slow motion what we have seen developing since then. And the trigger for this, at first rather cautious cooperation, were the Millennium Development Goals, which were the result of the Millennium Summit in the year 2000. The Millennium Development Goals were drafted in the office of Kofi Annan, drawing on some expert opinion. They weren't actually drawn up by member states. Member states blessed them, and they were launched. They were very attractive. They were simple. There were a very limited number of them. There were a very limited number of measurable targets and indicators whereby the targets would be measured. They seemed impulsively ambitious in the year 2000, and many cynics thought, oh, well, there goes the UN again, another pointless resolution. But as it turned out, most of the Millennium Development Goals over a 15-year period were achieved. Now, there was a proximate reason for the achievement of these goals. The 15 years of the goals coincided with the first extended economic growth spurt of all three developing continents in recorded post-World War II history. So economic growth remains absolutely critical to achieving many other objectives in society and in parliaments around the world. At the same time, we've come to understand even more than we did in the year 2000 how endangered the globe is by climate change and other forms of environmental degradation. And the Dresden Nexus program actually touches on a number of these, a number of the targets of the Millennium Development Goals, and even more of the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals that succeeded them in the year 2015. These goals, although much expert advice was received, and the Secretary General weighed in several times, were negotiated amongst the member states. That results in a much less selective package, a much more comprehensive package. In that sense, a very attractive package, but a very difficult package to implement in a poor developing country, or even a prosperous middle-income country, even my country, Canada, which is a moderately wealthy country, tackling 17 development goals, 159 or 69 targets, and over 200 indicators is a very tall order. Now, and this brings me to an instance in which the UNU system was able to partner with other actors in the UN. It turned out that in developing countries, the Sustainable Development Goals were often warmly embraced and quite sincerely, but championed particularly by sectoral ministries like health, education, agriculture, because each of these ministries saw their own mandate as reflected in the goals. And they found the goals very empowering for their sector of the economy. And they made their arguments to the public, in parliament, and in cabinet, often invoking their sustainable development goal. But a very smart colleague of mine in the UN system, Amina Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General from Nigeria, kept hearing that while sectoral ministries were dead keen and country leaders were often dead keen, finance ministries were pretty agnostic, if not indifferent, to the Sustainable Development Goals, because there was just too much there, and it empowered so much advocacy that the finance ministries, the budget planners, and others responsible for the money felt absolutely overwhelmed by all these claims on limited sums of money. So the Deputy Secretary General explained this problem to the heads of UN agencies, funds, and programs, the heads of the IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization. Everybody agreed there was a problem, but somehow nothing much happened for a year. And then Ms. Mohammed thought of UNU as a group of researchers focused on development and asked a few of us if we would think with some UN colleagues, drawing also on the wealth of expertise of SDSN, a network led by Jeff Sachs that many of you know, where Chandrika Bahadur was of great assistance to us, and Jeff was of great encouragement to us in tackling how to make the SDGs more relevant to finance ministries and budget planners. How could we demonstrate that the SDGs weren't a problem for them, but actually an asset to them? And it was by partnering with all of the UN agencies, with the IMF, with the World Bank, who are amongst the very first to contribute to the effort, very thoughtfully, not at all dogmatically, as sometimes they used to be when I was a young guy. We came up with something called the Sdg Primer. So it doesn't redefine the SDGs. We had no ambition to redefine them. We think they're just fine as they are. Rather, it sought to interpret them in ways that finance ministries and budget ministries might find useful. You can find them, the Sdg Primer, online today. Go to the UN website. It's not an easy website to navigate, but if you go to the SDG subset of the UN website, you'll find it quite easily, and you'll see how a relatively condensed text was ultimately agreed, boiled down from, I can't tell you how many submissions, all of them thoughtful, but all of them needing to be reduced to an essential proposition, something that isn't always easy to do. So we tend to want to be useful not only to developing countries, but also to the UN itself as an institution. We don't have the delusions of grandeur. We're a small institution, and we can't take on the world's research on behalf of the UN. There are so many fantastic research groups in universities, outside universities, in the private sector, in the public sector, all over the world, but we can help occasionally. And when we do help, it's nearly always through partnership. I'm going to stop now. You've heard quite enough from me. Once again, I'm truly sorry not to be with you. I would learn so much from your conference, being the reverse of an expert on water, soil, and waste, and how they come together productively or can. But I would have been very, very keen on learning. Learning can be a lifelong vocation. It's one of the satisfactions of growing older. One can go on learning. Slower than young people, less acutely, but in the case of individuals like Amartya Sen, the patron saint of development economics, sometimes one can grow wiser. And Amartya illustrates this every time he intervenes in public debates. Thank you all very much. And Adel, congratulations to you and our colleagues at in Dresden, our university partner in Dresden, the Technical University of Dresden, one of Germany's 10 excellence universities, who have pulled off this conference, for all of you online attending, presenting, debating, and moving the debate and knowledge forward. Thank you all very much.